Now, tithing did become law, and it did become law under the Old Testament law. The first time that tithing is required by the people of God is in Leviticus chapter 27. And there's a parallel passage in Deuteronomy, but Leviticus is the first passage to ever mention this. Children of Israel, they've come up out of Egypt. Okay? Now, there's several aspects to this. If we look in Leviticus chapter 27, verse 30, Moses establishes this as a requirement for the people of God. And Moses says in Leviticus 27, verse 30, Moses said, every tithe of the Lord, whether of the seed of the land, now think about this. Think about what all is required here. Remember what was happening in Matthew. Jesus is not condemning the scribes and the Pharisees for their giving of their tithes. Jesus condemns them because they give the tithe but forget the other aspects, the things of the heart. And so here Moses says, whether of the seeds of the land, in other words, your grain, your wheat, your oats, or the fruit of the trees, your apples, your pears, your pomegranates in that area, dates, is the Lord's. It is holy to the Lord. If a man wishes to redeem some of his tithe, he shall add a fifth to it. In other words, they were given an option. If they wanted to keep part of their tithe, they could do it with a monetary value. Instead of giving, let's say, for example, you have a very small date crop, and you need that for your family. And instead of giving 10% of that date crop to God, you had the option to instead redeem it by adding 5% more to it. Or not 5%, but a fifth, I'm sorry. A fifth more above and beyond any monetary value. And so you could redeem that date crop and keep it for your family. So if a man wishes to redeem some of his tithe, he shall add a fifth to it. And every tithe of herds and flocks, every tenth animal of all that pass under the herdman's staff. In other words, when they would count them, they would run them in a line. And the herdman would hold out his staff and count the animals as they passed underneath of his staff. And he says, every tenth animal of all that pass under the herdman's staff shall be holy to the Lord. One shall not differentiate between good or bad. They were not to select out the 10 best or the 10 worst. They were just simply to count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And the 10th one would be pulled out and given to the Lord. Neither shall he make a substitute for it. So of the flocks and herds, goats and sheep, no substitute was to be made. And if he does substitute for it, then both it and the substitute shall be holy, and it shall not be redeemed. In other words, you'd lose both of them. These are the commandments that the Lord commanded Moses for the people of Israel on Mount Sinai. So, I want us to think about this for a moment. What's happening is, God is requiring, for the first time in human history, what I would refer to as a taxation. Look at it as taxes. Okay, now herein comes the problem. Who likes taxes? It's not me. I can tell you that, and I suspect it's not any of us. I have yet to meet the demented person who likes taxes. Although I think we might have one in office. But, see, here's the problem. Herein comes the problem. What we see is Abraham sets a pattern, and and it's of his own free will, his own volition. But now, this is required. And when you require something from somebody, then you begin to grumble. When we pay our taxes every year, and this year especially, we got all the child tax credits were paid early last year and all of that stuff, and we get to meet up with the accountant, and he's like, well, this is what you owe, and I go, okay, so nobody likes taxes. Nobody really liked tithes under the Old Testament. Now, there is a logical reason as to why God set the tithe up. The reason that God set the tithe up at this point is before this, there was no need of a tithe. Okay? God set up the tithe for the Levitical priesthood. When the children of Israel came up, how many tribes were there, kids? 5. No, you got to count better than that. 12. There were 12 tribes in Israel. I'm not going to name them all, but there were 12. And God said in the book of Numbers, Moses was to number the people. God said, do not number the tribe of Levi, because their service is to God. All right? So if we look at the book of Numbers, actually let's look at Deuteronomy first and see what this tithe was to be used for. Deuteronomy chapter 10. So in Deuteronomy chapter 10, the purpose for the tithe was this. Verse 8. Let me find it. Verse 8. At that time, the Lord set apart the tribe of Levi to carry the ark of the covenant of the Lord, to stand before the Lord, to minister to him, and to bless his name to this day. Therefore, Levi has no portion or inheritance with his brothers. The Lord is his inheritance, as the Lord your God said to him, I myself stayed on the mountain as at the first time, 40 days and 40 nights, and the Lord listened to me that time also. The Lord was unwilling to destroy you, and the Lord said to me, arise and go to your journey at the head of the people, so that many go in and possess the land which I swore to their fathers to give them. Moses said, when we go into the land, we don't have time to touch on it, but the land was divided. The land of Israel, when the children of Israel originally crossed the River Jordan into the nation of Israel, the land was divided out to every tribe. 11 portions the land was to be divided in. But there were 12 tribes. And Levi, the Levite priesthood, their job was to serve God. They were not given a portion of the land. Therefore, they had no way to earn a livelihood, to supply food and needs for their family. And so, that was the purpose of the tithe. It was to provide for all of the Levites who were to come and serve God. But even the Levites had to give a tithe of what they had to the temple. If we look at Numbers chapter 18, I want to go to Numbers chapter 18 for just a moment. And I want to begin in verse 21 while we're here in the book of Numbers. In Numbers chapter 18, verse 21. I want to see what Moses says here. Numbers 18:21. To the Levites I have given every tithe in Israel for an inheritance. So you see the tenth that every other family in Israel had to give. 1/10 went to Levi. That was their inheritance. In return for their service that they do, their service in the tent of meeting, so the people of Israel do not come to hear the tent of meeting, lest they bear sin and die. But the Levites shall do the service in the tent of meeting, and they shall bear their iniquity. They shall be a perpetual statute throughout your generations, and among the people of Israel they shall have no inheritance. For the tithe of the people of Israel, which they present as a contribution to the Lord, I have given to the Levites for an inheritance. Therefore I have said to them that they shall have no inheritance among the people of Israel. Now drop down to verse 25. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Moreover, you shall speak and say to the Levites, when you take from the people of Israel the tithe that I have given you from them for your inheritance, then you shall present a contribution from it to the Lord, a tithe of a tithe. In other words, the Levites also were required to give 10% of their income to the Lord. A tithe of a tithe, the Bible says. Now, you can imagine, as much as you and I dislike taxes, you can imagine that as Israel would fall into sin, one of the first things that they would let go of was the tithe. It was one of the first things. Okay, woohoo, we're no longer under God's law. I'm not getting. And I don't think it came about that way. I think it was more of a very slow progression. That very slowly God became less important to them in their lives. And as they fell away, well, I'm really supposed to tithe that, but yeah, it's just going to God. I'm really not that keen on God, and so they kept a portion of it. During King Hezekiah's great restoration of Israel, the King Hezekiah led Israel by example. I want you to notice this. If we go back into 2 Chronicles, Hezekiah tore down the altars to the pagan gods, and Hezekiah read the law of Moses, and he looked and he saw, and I'm going to paraphrase, leading up to this, Hezekiah looked in the law and he said, oh man, we have messed up big time. And so Hezekiah decided that he was going to lead the people back to God. One of the ways that he led was in the tithe. And he reestablished, the priesthood, the Levites had completely forsaken their job because they had no income. And so they went out and they bought ground and they did just exactly what every other Israelite did. They earned a living for their family. And so here's what happened. Hezekiah, at the beginning of chapter 31, reinitiates the Levitical priesthood. And in verse 10, it says, Azariah, the chief priest, who was of the house of Zadok, answered him, since they began to bring the contribution into the house of the Lord, we have eaten and had enough and have plenty left. For the Lord has blessed his people so that we have this large amount left. There's a couple of concepts. If you look at the very beginning of that chapter, Hezekiah is the first person to contribute. Verse 3, the contribution of King Hezekiah of his own possessions. Hezekiah led the people of Israel by first giving of what he had. And then he asked the children of Israel to give of what they had. And God prospered them because of their giving, because of their heart. And the priest said that there was plenty.